Right, so I'm just going to continue here with the program that I've been editing here in some of these live programming sessions up until now. Make sure, yes, everything streaming. So what we want to do now is just add textures to this. And since you've been doing this here in the lab session, then you're going to kind of have to tell me what I need to do and in which order. And it'd be nice to do it in an order where I can kind of test that everything I did at least worked, even though it brings weird results, rather than kind of putting, 20 lines of code in 5 different places in my code and then just crossing my fingers and hitting play. So do we feel like bottom up or top down approach is nice? Should we start in the shaders at the bottom and kind of work upwards from there?
If you want to test, I don't think you can start in the shaders.
Okay, so if I want to actually see the textures happening, then probably I have to start by loading in the textures. But I can do some things at least in the shaders and just see that at least my shader code is working. Okay, so we have the vertex shader and we have the fragment shader, and we want to add basically the attribute that we send in, which for every single vertex we want UV coordinates, which are the texture coordinates. So an attribute that is vec2 because it's just u and v, or just x and y. It's a 2-dimensional coordinate system, and we'll call it a_uv. All right, and the only thing we're going to do here in the vertex shader with that is we're going to just send it onwards into the rasterization and into the fragment shader. We want to use it in the fragment shader, so we have to use a varying variable to send it between. So this will be v uv. So our uv coordinates here. So is there any particular place where I want to do this in the main function? Yeah, doesn't matter. Might as well just do it here. And say here we have uv coords sent into per pixel use. So we simply say v, the varying variable for the uv coordinates, equals the attribute variable for the uv coordinates, and that is everything we do here. Having made a varying variable in the vertex shader, we must have that same varying variable in the fragment shader, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So we want to use it here. And something that happened to a few students here, or you have to realize, is that if you have a variable and you don't use it, even a uniform variable or whatever, if you don't use it, or if its use doesn't have any effect in any case on the output, like GL frag color here or GL position here, what happens is that the compiler will simply erase those variables. It'll just throw them away for optimization, which means that when you are in your shader code here trying to get a handle for something, like let's say we take material diffuse in the fragment shader and we stop using it here, and instead we say, okay, instead of material diffuse, I'm just going to use the UV or something. It won't work, this won't compile. What the compiler will do, it'll actually throw away the definition of U material diffuse as well. And that'll give us an error here in our code when we're trying to get a handle to U material diffuse. So it's not enough in any shader just to define a variable. You have to define it, and you have to use it in a meaningful way that has an effect on the output. Otherwise the compiler will throw it away, and you'll get an error when you try to get a handle to it. Anyway, so we need to do something with these UV coordinates, and since we don't have anything meaningful at this point to do with them, I was thinking we might just do something like GL frag. If we, for instance, now just do GL frag color equals that, then we're overriding everything here, and OpenGL will say, okay, or the compiler will say, well, then all of this doesn't have any effect because you do something else afterwards, and it'll throw all of these variables away as well. So let's just do glFragColor dot R equals, no, I'm just going to do something here with the red. This times UV, no, V underscore UV dot X. I'm just taking some value from there, affecting some value here, but all the values are doing something. So at least it should compile at this point.
Are you getting a handle to it and sending information to it?
No, at this point not. So we're going to have to do that next. Let's go into shaders here. What we can do though is just to see that everything still compiles. We don't get an actual crash. Okay, so it's compiling. We haven't ruined anything.
Also zeros out of that.
Oh yeah, there was red color in this.
It's also all pretty blue.
Yes, this was purple earlier. Fair enough. Okay, so what we need to do then is we're going to do it similarly to the other attributes, the normal and the position. So let's just say we make a UV location handle here. Use that here as well. And we use that to get a handle to the variable a underscore UV in our shader program. So still compiling. Fine. Now we need to send UV coordinates along with yes, our, let's see, along with the position and normal vertices. So here somewhere we probably have base 3D objects, and we'll just do this for the cube here. So I have a position array, I have a normal array. So how do I want my UV array to look?
It's two dimensional.
Okay, so it's a,
Plus values from 0 to 1.
okay. No. So what's the simplest way to do this?
I would say make 4 values and copy paste them 6 times.
Yes, that is great.
Setting values in.
Okay,
We can set it from.
we have. Wait, just going to check. Are we going in a circle here, or are we going back and forth?
We are going in a circle ahead.
We're going in a circle. Okay, so 0, 0.
0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0.
Okay, so we go 1 up, we go 1 to the side from there, and then 1 down from there.
Yes.
Okay, then we'll take this. Oh, like so. Ah, never mind. We'll just.
6 times.
Yeah, needed 6 times. This will fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Skip the last comma and call this UV array. So now we have UV coordinates that should go in a circle from 0 to 1 in all the dimensions. What do we need to add here? Okay, set UV attribute with the UV array, and we don't have that operation, so we're going to have to make that as well. So here, set position, normal, and UV attribute, or UV attribute or texture attribute. We get some vertex area in here. Change this to 2. Change this to UV. Is this enough? Okay. So let's see what happens. If it at least compiles. It's doing something. So it's not crashing, but everything it's doing seems to be extremely weird. I didn't expect it to be so
Have you done anything for the sphere?
No, yeah, okay, yeah, the sphere is so weird because we haven't done anything for the sphere. So let's just not draw the sphere. Let's simplify this program a little bit at this point. Just go into the program, go into our display routine here. Let's take the part that draws a sphere. Let's take that out. And we're drawing cubes here. Let's just skip this later one. No. Let's take this one out. This one back in. So, and see what happens now. Okay, so let's, do it for the sphere later. But does this red color, so it's there, but it's kind of gradiating from one corner, and that makes sense since we're basically telling the shader to take the red value and multiply that with basically the u coordinate of the uv coordinates, or the u dimension. It'll basically go always from one side and kind of gradient over to the other side, from purple to blue. Fair enough, but that's not kind of what we're looking for. All right, so now we at least know that our UV coordinates are working, and if we actually change this a little bit and go ahead with the color mainly, where did we set the color for all this? Where is shader set solid color? Am I missing something here in my own code?
Just using the diffuse color.
Okay, here I'm setting diffuse at least. Was it somewhere here, the diffuse? Doesn't matter. Oh, okay, there it is. Duh. Okay, so now I'm going to try to set that just to completely black. Just see exactly. Okay. We need the lights to. Now I'm only seeing specularity here. Put the whole thing to white. Of course, I was multiplying. Yeah. Makes sense. I shouldn't have done this. Here. So what I should have done was set only red to 1, the others to 0. That would be the effect that I was looking for. Okay. You can see that each side is kind of fading red from one side. So fine. Our UV coordinates are working. That part of our shader is working. What do we need to do next?
Load the texture.
Okay, so we need to load our texture image. Where would it be nice to store that? Would you do that in the shader function class or just somewhere here in our initialization?
Probably fine to do it in that section.
Okay. So what I have here, or was going to have here, let's go here, textures. Okay, so now I have this textures class here, and I have a few texture images. You start with text01.png. Great image. It'll be very clear that it has worked when it does work. All right, so where do we start? Okay, so we have a Pygame built-in function to read the image. That's fine to use. Pygame dot image
And then the path.
dot load.
Yeah.
Load what?
The path to the image texture.
So Pygame dot image dot load.
Yeah. And it takes a string.
Yeah, because I don't get Pygame. All right, so it takes a path to the. Okay, let's say this dot path 0 plus, and what is it? Textures text01.png. Let's at least see if this compiles. Okay. So the next thing we do now, I have loaded this image into something like a surface. Okay, so let's just call this variable surface. That's this. Okay. Text string equals pygame.image string.
And you pass in your surface.
Okay.
Then a string RGBA, and then there's a flag where you want the y coordinates split.
Okay. Try it as 1, and we'll see what happens if we have it. Shouldn't it be true or false, or should it be 1 or 0?
It's 1 or 0.
Okay. Whether we want the y coordinates flipped or not.
And it's store the width and the height.
Okay. Some variable here called width.
That equals the surface of get width. It's a snake case get width.
Like so.
Yeah.
And another one for height. All right. So we're storing the height and the width to tell OpenGL how big this is when we send it there. Or something like that. So what's next?
Store texture ID. GL generate texture.
Like this.
And maybe 1 as a parameter.
Just a 1. Okay, so here we're telling OpenGL, I want you to make room in your system for a single texture, and I want to get that ID into here. You can look at different versions of GLGen textures to get kind of an array of values or something, or you can just call it again and again. So now we have that text ID. I guess we bind it next. That's an OpenGL function again, GL bind texture. GL bind texture. Texture 2D, this is a constant. And text ID. Okay, so now I've told OpenGL that this texture ID should be linked to whatever changes we do to textures at this point. Next. GL text image 2D, is that text image 2D? So now we're actually loading data to the texture, and now we have a bunch of stuff. GL texture 2D 0. Okay, yeah. Internal format GL RGBA. Width is width. Height is height. Border is 0. Format is again GL RGBA. Type is GL unsigned byte. And then we have the text string, which is the actual data. I have a typo in width. Width.
You probably might want to use the texture ID again, so it's stored inside.
Yeah. So we'd like to have a self.textID here.
And a also where you're putting it into the bind.
Ah, yes, obviously. Okay. No, that was not the place.
The one above.
This was the place. Thank you.
And also the one not used. No.
No, here's the text string. Okay. So what we get out of this, all of these, is we've told OpenGL to make space for a texture. We've put stuff into that texture. We've told OpenGL how to store it, and we've gotten an ID to this texture. So now we can use this ID to kind of have a handle onto this particular texture at any time. But now we need to figure out a way to actually use this handle, right? So where do we go next?
Do you need though? What we did was call an active texture before we draw, and then bind the texture. Really.
Okay. So by binding the texture, that is simply the texture that will be used. Okay. So you're not.
We're using GL active texture just before we draw something.
So you call GL active texture with a parameter.
Yeah, just a parameter GL texture 0, just to call it something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But I guess you've yet to figure out if that's enough if you're using more than one texture. If you want to switch to one texture to draw one cube and then another texture to draw another. Have you tried that? Have different textures on different things? Okay, we'll look at that later. Okay, but what we do need in the fragment shader is what here? Like, what do you set to this sampler then?
Uniform sampler 2D and just give it some name.
Okay, uniform sampler 2D. Let's just call it text1, something like that. And how do we use it?
You have to call a function called texture 2D.
Okay, so we call a function here, which is called texture 2D.
Inside you use a sampler 2D as the first parameter.
Okay, so our sampler variable here,
And then your texture coordinates.
v underscore uv.
And this will return a color variable.
Okay, so this returns a color.
Yeah, you should probably put where the three colors instead of the.
Okay, we could put it directly onto the GL color, but that'll kind of ruin all the other variables that we have.
What I did was multiply the material diffuse by what you get out of that.
Okay, so then we can say I'm going to make a variable that we're going to call what? vec4. Vec4, let's just call it material diffuse, which equals the uniform variable for material diffuse multiplied by what we get out of this. Diffuse. Okay, so we're taking the material diffuse that we get in, we're multiplying it with this, so we have a new color that's kind of a multiplication of the material diffuse that we send in. I would say right away, once we've done that, we would probably want to go ahead and set material diffuse just to 1, 1, 1, just have that white, and then that doesn't have any effect. Then we're just using this directly. Once we change.
Sorry, I did material diffuse equals texture 2D.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm simply not using this.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we would do in the end, yes, we would simply say this equals this, but then we'd have set up our shaders to use textures. I'm going to make as few changes as I possibly can. So I'm going to keep this in here just to not kind of ruin the rest of my chain of variables and values. So we're using both, but I set, at least at this point, I set the material diffuse to 1 before I draw this cube.
Yeah, that one.
So fragment shader. So we simply have a new color here. I, however, need to make sure that we're using this material diffuse and not the u underscore material diffuse. Now everything will have an effect. However, have we really, do we have the correct texture bound?
No.
It's active.
You have the...
And I also have this line still here, which I want to get rid of. So let's see what it looks like and see what we're missing. Okay, so this is just, the diffuse here is 0 now, there's nothing happening. So we need to, before we call draw,
To set GL active texture
active texture,
and GL texture 0 is what it is.
okay,
No, not the snake horizon.
like so. Okay, so we still seem to be having to have something missing.
Try calling, moving the bind after this line. So you're binding.
Okay.
Try to bind below this one after you activate this.
Something like this. I still feel that we would like to okay, yeah, so I'm binding texture 2D to this. I'm never really sending anything to the sampler though.
The bind texture does that.
So,
Or at least it's
Are you
supposed
calling
to.
bind texture twice now?
yes,
Comment out the one you did before.
I think.
Isn't like the texture on the inside the OpenGL thing, but you haven't specified in the shader which one.
Yeah, that's kind of what
So you have
I'm
to
wondering.
specify which texture ID.
Yeah.
You don't have to do that.
That's careful.
Okay. I'm gonna see if we can go down here and say, okay, I have the UV. Let's do something like this here. Set material, no, set texture. Let's just say set diffuse texture. Self and some text. So I have a feeling I'd like to set the UV location. We have that, UV location. Not shininess. Wait, I'm changing the wrong thing here. Like here, I wanted to change it here. And text. So, do you never call GL uniform with the texture in your version? Okay. So then I'd like to say, before I I'd like to actually skip this and say shader or self.shader dot set diffuse texture to self.text ID. Alright, where does this tell me I haven't? Oh, I didn't want to go there. GL uniform 1 self UV log. And I'm getting self UV location A underscore UV. So in the vertex shader we have A underscore UV. Ah, no, sorry. This is incorrect. No, wait, is it here that it's, no, yeah, because it's two numbers that should go in there. No, I wasn't going to use UV look. Okay, sorry.
But you need like a
Back.
new one.
I need a new one, yes, for the sampler. So obviously the UV coordinates are something entirely different. So we want a diffuse texture location. Like so. And what we're going to take there is, let's call it U_text01. Here, and we're going to stick that in here. So texture location, this variable, the variable that we're using in here. All right, diffuse texture, self-text, so we're definitely using self diffuse texture location. Obviously we can't send a single value into the UV coordinates. Okay, not getting anything here. So where's our error here?
I didn't forget to save it.
Is your material diffuse at 0?
Let's check out, but I'm pretty sure it isn't. My material diffuses at 1. So you talked about doing GL
I tried removing it on my end and it works without it.
active texture.
Yeah, that doesn't do anything.
Yeah, I thought
Can you see
so.
where you load the image again?
Let's see where we load the image.
There are 2 lines that I did you don't have, which is
Yeah.
gigabyte texture.
Yes.
And use 2 parameters, a GL text parameter.
Yeah. I doubt that it'll have an effect.
And then an I.
GL text parameter I. Yeah.
And it's GL texture 2D snippets sometimes with GL texture mark filter.
Shouldn't matter.
GL linear. No, it shouldn't matter. Like if you copy that line completely and change the mark to me.
It shouldn't affect. Well, not the fact that it doesn't.
Oh, it's hash. That's fine. That's good.
So what we can do here is as well, like, do the shaders compile and everything. Okay, so what worked for you doesn't seem to be working completely here. So is there something I'm missing here? Do you have it working on your computers at this point?
Can I see it again?
Which one?
The graph thing. No, I mean where you.
Here's display. Here's where I'm drawing.
Load the image, I mean that.
Okay.
Okay, it is correct.
Mm-hmm. Loading the text image here.
What if you drop the self because you don't actually read it?
Text ID.
Yeah. That does it have any?
It shouldn't have any effect.
Alright.
It's just a value. It's just a variable. I'll get an error someplace else. So it'll tell me that there isn't.
Oh yeah.
Because I was trying to send it in here.
Oh yeah, well, you need to.
Did you
No,
call
it worked.
Okay, so now it's working. Why indeed?
I think it was because you said set diffuse texture, but this would be.
Yeah, okay, so I'm not sending anything into the sampler at this point. So the sampler is just using,
Whatever it finds in byte.
yeah, okay. So then the question is, no, I probably shouldn't be sending the texture ID.
Can you just
I should be binding a specific texture to the texture ID.
now you're binding in bind texture, you're binding the texture ID, but could you not just generate one texture per texture and keep it in an array and switch between them like so? That's not over engineering.
No, so if I want to have more than one texture, I need some way of switching between them.
Yes.
So let's say I want to draw 2 cubes here now. So I'm going to take this cube here and I'm just going to copy the entire code. Except the only difference is, well, let's translate it to three above the other one. Let's see if we have 2 cubes now. Probably both rotating in the same way, displaying the same texture. Where is this light? Okay, so here are the cubes. And you can see that the specularity is calculated independently, which makes it super cool. Now I would like to load another texture and use that on my other cube. So we kind of have to figure out how we actually set this. Okay, so what do we do?
Where you're loading the image.
So I'm going to load the image.
If you put this into a function,
Yeah.
call it again between, but maybe that's no one can have.
No, I think that's
That's the right thing to do.
that's the right thing to do here. So not doing it in a great place, you should probably do it in a separate class or something like that, but let's do something like load texture here. Let's have that take in a path string and what? Yes, self. Like so. In this case, we will copy all of this, stick it in the function. Instead of this, we're going to use this. Well, let's just say load path string. And everything else is done the same, except
You need to return the texture ID.
return the text ID. Okay, so I'm returning this texture ID from this function. That means I'm going to take this entire thing and take it away and say, I'm going to say some texture ID 01 equals self dot load texture with this. All right. Except now I want to see what other textures I have here. Let's just say space text here. Spec text. I don't know. Let's do the dice one. So it's called dice.png. All right, so I'm loading 2 textures here. Now the question is, or I'm going to make them self. How do I switch between them?
In your draw function,
Okay, so in the draw function,
when you call
I need to bind this texture somewhere.
yes, you just do GL bind texture
Okay, GL bind texture.
and GL texture to do distinctive.
Okay.
And the ID of the texture you want to use.
Okay, so self dot texture ID1. and texture ID 2. Okay, so
Hey,
this is working fine. So now I kind of have to get some information across, and I hope it makes sense. So we can still, and this is kind of, I'm remembering this from the last time I did this. So the sampler, yes, the sampler just takes from an active texture that's active in OpenGL at this point. But we can still have more than one sampler. So we do have to give them different values, and we do sometimes have to bind more than one texture. That's the reason for this constant here, GL. Let's see if it gives us the constants that start like this. So we have here texture 0, 1, and a bunch of
31.
up to 31. Okay. So we have 31 different textures that we can bind. Can someone figure out how we bind different samplers to different textures? Can someone Google that and see if we can? The active texture. But the active texture is just, I want a way to set my sampler. Can I go in here? Just do set active, no, set sampler to texture. Okay, so it's uniform sampler 2D texture 1.
I managed to get two textures just by calling bind with the ID again.
Using two textures at the same time.
Yeah, I used two textures at the same time. And just
Like in your shader, yeah.
Yeah. No, not in the shader. Just use the shader like normal. But before I draw a cube, I call GL bind again with the texture I want.
Yes, that's what I'm doing as well. But I mean, like in the shader, I want to go into the fragment shader and I want to make another sampler.
No, I'm just binding again and it binds to the same one. But
And I want one of them to be my specularity, and the
okay.
other one, I want to do this.
I have no idea how to do that.
Exactly. Specular equals material specular times texture number 2. And then I want to use material specular like this. And then I want to go in here and I want to say, not shaders, control program. Yeah, no, okay. This is basically what I want to do. So now my question is, I need a way to tell this sampler here which texture it uses. And actually, we basically send to it just either GL texture 1, GL texture 2, GL texture 3, GL texture 4.
You do that in GL active texture.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just switching on or off textures that are active. But the question is, okay, which means if we go into the shader, I would simply like to go ahead and say, let's just skip this function then here.
Yeah, I don't think that's needed.
Yeah. Instead, I'm going to take my texture here, diffuse texture location. I'm going to make another one. We are going to call this like so. We're going to make another one for texture 2 here. Call it specular texture lock. Location. Fine. So here, specular texture location. Okay, so except what we're going to send in here is GL texture 1. And in here, GL texture 2. So now the question is, if I go into my main program here, that's probably what I do when I load them. Or actually here, if I say, ooh, this is tricky. All right, here we have bind texture. So we said GL active texture. So can someone just, or we can find out GL active texture, just to read what that does. Specifies which texture unit to make active. The number of texture units is zero, okay. The initial value is texture 0. Selects which texture unit subsequent texture state calls will affect. So what we would like to do okay, so if I now say, what textures are we reading in here? Okay, I'm going to make more of these. I really want to feel that we can read all of these in, and then we can select which one is used as which part in this. So I know it's late. We have kind of 10 minutes to actually get this working, but I'd like to see at least this work, because we got it to work. We got some texture there, but I have a feeling that we were still kind of missing things. We didn't have full control of what was there. It was just kind of some texture. So I would like to take all of these textures that we have here. I'm going to take Phobos here. Phobos 2K. It's a good resolution. And we have dice and spectex 01. 01.png. I'm going to read all of these in, and I'm going to say texture, just texture ID 1, texture ID dice, texture ID, to make this all super clear, texture ID specular. This is kind of like raindrops on a window type texture. All right. Now we're probably gonna, so let's find where this is here. ID 0 and texture ID dice. Let's take this out and see if we at least can have this working the way it was working. Okay, except that we are going to go into the Fragment Shader, and I'm going to take this out for now. Okay, just make sure things compile. Okay, no, I don't know what that is. Okay, so this is still not working here. Oh. Okay, so we have the dice texture on one, texture on the other. Let's see what happens if we go into the Fragment Shader. This back in. This back in. Is anything happening now? No, the specularity is out. So now we would like to go in here. So So I'm wondering if it's as simple as just saying that in the fragment shader, this one will take text 0 and this one will take text 1. So in here, I'm binding the texture to this. Why doesn't this crash or something if I have a half line there that doesn't do anything? Okay. But if I do GL active texture, GL texture 2D, GL texture 0.
I think I take the bind feature away. I mean, like it might do the same thing pretty much.
The bind.
Yeah, but it's.
Well, I'm binding this particular texture ID to the active texture at this point. Here I'm saying the active texture is texture 0. So I want to see what happens if I go ahead and do active texture is texture 1. I'm going to bind this ID to that. Just see what happens. Where does this crash? Here. It's just like this, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Just the texture 0 and the texture 1. Doesn't seem to be working. So this is kind of the trick. How do I... So active texture, texture unit, effect.
Can you try it without bind?
Hmm.
Can you try it without bind?
Without the bind.
Yeah, the last one.
Just skip this bind. Okay, let's see what happens here. Okay, now I have the same image in both, even though I'm still doing this bind here.
You're not activating another. Oh, you're activating texture 1 and then you're binding again.
Yes, so if I do it this way,
It should be both dice. Right?
no, now 1 is the dice. So this is working correctly. The thing that's happening here is when I call GL bind, it will bind this texture kind of ID, this particular texture image, to the active texture, which is texture 0 here. Once I set that to texture 1 up here and bound something to texture 1, okay, I'm still binding. So now both of them are the first image. I'm still binding the second image, but I'm binding it to texture 1, which is the wrong image. So now I still want to see.
But do you need to bind them like every time? Just like if you bind them.
No. Yeah, exactly. No, I don't need to actually. If I'm binding them separately, but I do have to bind if I want them both to be on texture 0, because I both want them to be the diffuse texture. Then yes, then I do need that. Then I need to. I mean, if I don't bind it again, then it'll just always be the same image. So if I take this bind out, it'll just always be the same image. So if I've been setting up a different active texture here, trying to do something, then in order, see if I skip this one, it'll also always be the same image. I need both. I need to say, okay, I'm going to set a texture now, and I'm going to set the active texture to texture 0, because that's what my sampler is taking from. Again, this is the same image on both. Now if I have both of these lines, I get the other texture on the other one. So this much we know. We need to set the active texture to texture 0. And we also, now we have separate ones here, and we also need to bind the specific texture ID. However, since we're using texture ID 0 here, then obviously we're still in our fragment shader. These samplers are still always just using texture ID 0. So what we want to do, we want to be able to actually link these. So what I did earlier, I'm going to see if that was my error here. I was linking them to texture 1 and 2, and 2 is never an active texture here. I'm going to see if this may work. Or, better yet, if we should put them into functions again, which I threw out, I guess. Okay, since the shader has all this, we kind of need an operation to do this. Just stick it here at the bottom. Define set text. Okay, so we need a particular texture location. Set diffuse texture. And I'm actually going to just take no parameter here for now. We'd like to do that later on. I'm going to grab this. I'm wondering if we're doing it before we have anything in these textures. So okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do set spec text. And this should be specular texture location. So we're not calling this, so everything should at least compile now and run. We haven't gotten our changes yet. Okay, now I want to do it in the I want to go ahead here. We've bound this texture. I want to go ahead and do self.shader set diffuse text. I'm at least going to see if this crashes or not. Okay. This doesn't want me to call GL uniform for sampler. Yeah, oh, okay. I'm wondering if that's the problem. And maybe I should have read the error. Should maybe be one I here. That's a good point. Oh, that's not it. What's the complaint? Okay, I'm gonna see here GL uniform fails to set sampler value. Okay, so what is he doing here? This is his shader, sampler TD, blah, blah, blah. We have that working. GL uniform 1I. Get uniform location, blah, 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 for texture. And he's just setting it to 1. Not this. So let's try 0 and let's try 1 and see what happens now. Let's try 1 here. Whew. All right. Again, explanations are needed. Sorry about this. I was using the constant for GL texture 0, but if you just set 1 here, then we're basically telling OpenGL, well, I wonder if it's possible to set. So wait, it's using both of them now. Okay, but it's using them the wrong way around, not the way I thought. Can you see? It's using what I wanted to be a specular texture as a diffuse texture, but it's using the other image as a specular texture. I want it the other way around. So I really want to make it work other way around, but why did 0, why did it complain about that?
Try setting diffuse to 2, because it might be the IPs. If the IT won't be 0, it will be 1 and 2 for the loaded.
Yeah.
So the specular should be 2 and 1, I think.
Well, I'm not calling the second one anyway. So I'm going to see what happens if I set it to 2. Now they...
Same thing.
Is it? Well, I kind of seem to both be the specular texture. No one's in the diffuse.
People call the same.
Okay, so I'm going to say set diffuse text here to 1. Set the other one to 2. I am going to go into this. I'm going to say set active texture texture 0. Bind this texture and set diffuse text. Set active texture texture 1. Set this one and set specular text. Possibly this will work at least for one of these cubes. No, I'm not getting any of it. I'm just getting that one. One. So okay. So in shaders, did we try to set one of them to 0 and that didn't work either? Yeah, because, yeah. Okay, now something is happening here. And then let's set this one to 1. And now, each of these still only the specular one. Okay, so diffuse texture location, specular texture location. We're reading them from text 1 and text 2 here in the fragment shader. Text 1 and text 2. Text 2 is used on the specular. Fine. Okay. How does it work on your side? This is binding texture 0. And set diffuse text. Oh. Okay, let's look at this. Okay, now, all right, finally. Do you see it happen now? I was just mixing numbers around there. So we have a diffuse color now, which is our main color, which is the dice here and the weird image on the other one. Okay? But we have the other texture being affected by the specularity. So what we need to do here is, okay, so by saying active texture is texture 0, I am saying that the texture 0 is the texture part, or the texture, what was it called? Well, the main texture that we are setting every time we call something like bind texture, or if we call what we have up here, text parameter, or whatever texture state calls we call, they will affect whatever we called the active texture. Okay, so we set active texture to texture 0. Then we bind texture to this particular texture image, which is the image of the weird scribbly things that I made. And then we call set diffuse texture. And in the shader, we're not taking any variable in there. We should actually go ahead here and say set diffuse text this, and just num, just some number. And set number here. Do the same thing on the other side. Oops. So number here, and then it can be a little bit clearer here, because we're going to say I'm going to set the diffuse text to 0, which means texture number 0. So we just use an integer here, 0, 1, 2, 3, whereas here we use these constants from OpenGL. I'm going to set the specular texture to 1. So I'm going to say my active texture is texture 1, and I'm going to load an image into the active texture, because this never takes the ID or anything like that. But I'm going to say this ID should be bound to the active texture, and I've set the active texture to texture 1. And then I'm going to set the specular texture in my shader to 1. So I've bound a specific ID to a specific texture part, and I've set my sampler to read from that. So yes, texture 0 will now be texture ID 1, and that will be sent into the shader for the diffuse texture. Texture 1 will now be this image, and that will be sent into the shader 1 as the specular texture. That's how I draw the first one. The second one, I set GL texture 0, I load the dice image, and I set the diffuse texture with 0. I, however, don't change the specular texture, so that just continues being whatever it was. So that means at this point, I've got these separate in my shader. And so one of these images is affecting diffuse, and you can see it's constant, it's just affected by the light where the light is. The other one is only affected by how the light reflects into the camera, so we actually have to find kind of a correct location to see that happen. We can see it kind of dropping in exactly when the light and the camera kind of line up. So you can see there. So they just kind of go in instead of the full specularity. So now we have separate textures. I'm sorry it took this long, but I did promise you that I wouldn't come prepared. I would expect us to figure this out as we go. I didn't want to make a recording that was this long doing that, but people who didn't show up will just have to wade through all this video to find what really matters. But in our fragment shader now, we have one sampler and another sampler, and we use these to affect different things in the shader. And now we can continue. We can do the same thing. And in our program here, we could use texture 3, 4, 5, 6 up to 31. So we have 32 different textures that we can use. We can use a texture for an alpha value, for instance, for transparency or for opacity. We can use a texture and we can read its values as vectors rather than as colors. So we can set up a vector map, so each and every pixel has a different kind of change to the normal. So we have the base normal, then we add to that base normal a normal that we get from the color, and then we can use that in our lighting calculation. So we can have a normal map. We can have a bump map, which is basically a grayscale image from black to white, kind of representing height, and then we calculate normals from the differences between these pixels and use those to affect the lighting. So we use these bump maps to affect the normal, so we have a different normal affected by a different texture normal in every single calculation here. So when we calculate Lambert and Fong, this normal here will actually be affected by something. Here we're just affecting the material diffuse and the material specular by the textures. We can also affect the normal by the texture. We can take in several different texture images and use them any way we want. We can use them to actually make things disappear, like in billboarding, where you have an image, like an image of a tree that you just want to put in the world, but you want to see through everything that's around the tree in the image. So you can just draw a single polygon with the image of the tree, but you can use the texture to decide which part of these images will be visible and which parts won't. So on and so forth. Are there questions at this point? I really wanted to do more stuff like texture map the sphere and things like that, but I'm going to have to save that for later. Anything else? Do we feel like we kind of are at the point where we understand this? I know this took a while for me on the projector, but I'm hoping like by going through this together, at least we understand what these different things do. Other than that, I'll take a walkthrough through this code and kind of explain it and maybe texture map the sphere and stuff later on. But thank you very much for today, and see you soon.